Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to today's webinar on human trafficking. Please be advised we will be recording this webinar, which will later be posted to ANA web pages as a resource along with other great webinars. Before we jump into our topic, we'd like to take a moment to share information about the Administration for Native Americans, or ANA. ANA provides discretionary funding with the aim of achieving the vision, Native communities are thriving. The meaning of thriving is intended to be defined by each of the unique projects developed by Alaska Native and Native American communities, which have successfully been awarded funding under ANA. Today's webinar is hosted by the Alaska Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. Responsible for oversight of the services at Alaska Region team is Anthony Kaoli, the Regional Director. We also have Training Manager Angela Camos. The most recent addition to the team is Tim Anderson, who serves as the Technical Assistant Manager, and I am Richard Perry, Outreach and Technology Specialist. You see here we have the other regions and the links to their pages and sites. Alaska Region is one of several teams throughout the nation. All the training and technical assistance that is provided by the Regional Training and Technical Assistance Center teams are provided free of charge. Feel free to ask for guidance, clarification, and help from any of our teams. In addition to providing these types of service, we also provide an ongoing webinar series with topics that are relevant to the types of funding requests that are being submitted by applicants, as well as topics that highlight the successes of existing grantees. We each work with ANA and the other regions to create and share useful tools, manuals, and highlighting best practices in an effort to ensure that organizations are receiving the highest quality services and the most up-to-date tools. I'd like to point out that WebEx, once you sign off, will link you to an evaluation page. Additionally, we'll be sending to you an email that has a link for an evaluation for our own team at Alaska Region. If you please, help us improve our webinar by providing your feedback. It is important for us to make these webinars effective and the best they could be. And one more thing before we begin, if you're online for this webinar, look for the chat icon. We'll be using this to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. Today's webinar, Human Trafficking, will feature presentations from Heather Hagelberger and Elizabeth Pfenning. Heather is the Human Trafficking Project Coordinator with the Alaska Native Justice Center, or ANJC. She has 15 years of experience working with trauma victims in various settings, including the healthcare field. She has 5 years of experience advocating for and engaging with survivors of human trafficking. We also have Beth, Program Specialist with the HHS Office on Trafficking In Persons, or OTIP, where she manages the Training and Technical Assistance portfolio, including the Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, or NHTTAC, and the SOAR to Health and Wellness Training, where she supports anti-trafficking interagency partnerships. Prior to federal service, she worked in women's health and spent 6 years working with and on behalf of trafficking survivors. Before we get started, we would like to make everyone aware of the upcoming events that you see here. Speaking of which, if you have not signed up for our newsletter that is produced by the Regional Training and Technical Assistance Center, I would encourage you to do that to keep up to date on what is available. The newsletter offers announcements for events in your region. Each region has pre-app training and project planning and development training advertised. If you are interested in attending, be sure to register by checking with the region, its webpage, or social media announcements. There are a wide range of selected topics of each region's offer, including webinars such as the one today, relating to the issues that are ongoing and provide guidance on ANA programmings or funding opportunity announcements and changes. Now I'd like to begin the webinar on human trafficking with Beth, the Program Specialist with the HHS Office on Trafficking In Persons. Beth, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Richard. And I'd like to take a moment to thank our colleagues with ANA and Richard and your team with the Alaska Region T&TA Center for putting this on and bringing us all together on this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us. really coming together today to discuss this important issue during National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month. So during this webinar today, Heather and I are going to be providing you all with an understanding of human trafficking and how it impacts Native communities. We'll also be sharing important information regarding existing federal resources and the role of awareness-raising efforts to date. And then finally, we'll be discussing next steps for localizing those responses. So before we kick off into actually discussing the meat of human trafficking, both Heather and I want to provide a brief overview of our agencies and who we represent. So I, as Richard had mentioned, am from the HHS Office on Trafficking in Persons, which was established as a standalone office within the Department of Health and Human Services in June of 2013. And we're responsible for the development of anti-trafficking strategies, policies, and programs to prevent human trafficking, to build the Health and Human Services capacity to respond to this issue, and to really increase victim identification and access to services. And our office is very privileged and fortunate to partner with the Administration for Native Americans on targeted efforts for our vulnerable Native communities on this particular issue. Our office, like many offices within the HHS, do administer grant programming. We have grant programs specific to services for both foreign national and domestic victims of human trafficking, along with awareness-raising efforts. We also supervise the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is a resource for you all that we'll discuss in greater detail later in this presentation. To contextualize our approach as an office, in the past, our approach to human trafficking as a field, as a nation, has really been dominated by the criminal justice framework, where we've really, from a state, federal, tribal, and local perspective, really been focusing on awareness raising, on policing, and on the prosecution of cases. And while this perspective is an important one, there's this understanding that we're not going to be arresting our way out of this issue. We realize that human trafficking also needs to be addressed from a public health perspective, because this is a crime, this is an issue, a form of violence that affects individuals, families, and communities across entire generations. And this training today is really reflective of that paradigm shift. And one of the primary benefits of viewing human trafficking from a public health perspective is really the emphasis on prevention and recognizing what we call social and economic determinants of health that may lead to trafficking. And by looking at these systemic issues that cause people to be vulnerable to human trafficking in the first place, we are better positioned to develop and to deliver effective interventions aimed at preventing and reducing the harmful impacts of this issue. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to introduce her organization.
Thank you so much, Beth. So the Alaska Native Justice Center was established in 1993 by the Cook Inlet Regional Corporation, also known as CIRI, and it is a tribal nonprofit to address Alaska Natives' unmet needs regarding the Alaska civil and criminal justice system in response to the increasing disproportionate rates of victimization, incarceration, and other justice-related issues impacting Alaska Natives throughout Alaska. In 2016, ANJC became a subsidiary of Cook Inlet Tribal Council and sister nonprofit of CIRI. The new partnership provides support for ANJC, which allows ANJC to increase its capacity to serve participants. Through this partnership, ANJC has been able to build up capacity to provide services to all ethnicities and integrate Alaska Native culturally based advocacy programs and intervention initiatives based on the 4 focus pillars set by the ANJC Board of Directors: education, restorative justice, advocacy for victims, and social justice advocacy. Through these pillars of justice, ANJC is able to assist in the resolution of legal circumstances such as divorce, child custody, domestic violence, sexual assault, and adult prisoner reentry. In 2016, ANJC was awarded the ACS Domestic Victims of Human Trafficking Grant in order to extend services to victims of human trafficking. Through this grant, ANJC has been able to build up a cohesive team of local social service organizations in order to provide trauma-informed services for victims of all ages. In our efforts to continue to enhance communication between community organizations, service providers, and law enforcement, ANJC has established a working relationship with the Anchorage FBI human trafficking workforce. ANJC continues to increase awareness of the epidemic of human trafficking by offering trainings to Alaska Native agencies, local nonprofits, youth organizations, healthcare organizations, government agencies, and airlines. And so with that, Beth will now tell us about TSAP.
Thanks, Heather. So before we kind of delve into trafficking and its impact on Native communities specifically, we want to provide a grounding in the definition here. So in 2000, the United States passed the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, or what we call the TVPA, which defined the crime, it created new laws, and it established remedies or services for victims of this crime. And today, I'm delighted to say that all 50 states, including a handful of tribes, have actually passed comprehensive legislation specific to human trafficking. Now, I'm not going to bore anyone with the legalese here by reading the criminal statute, but what we've done here is we've broken down the legal definition by using what we call the action, means, and purpose model. So I want you to think of these three columns that you see here on this slide as buckets, where you need to prove at least one element and only one from each in order for it to constitute human trafficking. So human trafficking is the recruiting, the harboring, the transporting, the providing or obtaining of an individual by force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of compelled labor or commercial sex. Now, one amendment to this, in the first column under the action column, you'll see an asterisk under 3 additional actions of patronizing, soliciting, and advertising. Now, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act of 2015 actually expanded the definition of sex trafficking, and only sex trafficking, to include these 3 additional actions. However, I will say that this is a relatively new piece of legislation, and the case law right now is still relatively new, but be aware that those are additional actions to consider. And then finally, one caveat to all of this is when a minor, someone under the age of 18, is involved for commercial sex, in which that middle column of means disappears. So that burden of proof no longer exists for a minor. The very fact that a minor cannot consent to sex, or in this case commercial sex, is enough to prove inducement, and children, minors, are automatically recognized as victims. Now, we know that your role, as diverse as they are on this webinar, is really not necessarily to make a legal determination or discern whether or not a patient or a client of yours is actually being trafficked. However, it really is important for you guys to understand the legal definition here and to use this action, means, and purpose model as a framework for recognizing and identifying some of the red flags that Heather and I will get into later in this presentation. Now, if we move on to the next slide, the TVPA further identifies 2 types of human trafficking: sex trafficking and labor trafficking. So sex trafficking is the recruitment, the harboring, the transporting, providing, or obtaining of a person for the purposes of a commercial sex act, in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. Now, one clarifying point that we'll make here is that the use of the term commercial, there is a misconception here that there has to be money that is offered in exchange for that commercial sex act. But in reality, it's anything of value. So we have situations in which a victim is offering or exchanging a commercial sex act in exchange for something to meet their most basic needs. So food, shelter, clothing. We have situations in which that commercial sex act is done in exchange for drugs. So that is a commercial sex act by virtue of something of value being given in exchange for that. Other examples of sex trafficking could include the forced prostitution of adults, any type of prostitution of children, and finally pornography. So for labor trafficking, similar to sex, it's the same actions that we've been talking about: the recruiting, the harboring, the transporting, the providing or obtaining of an individual for the purpose of labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. Now, examples of this could include debt bondage, or forced labor, or involuntary child labor. And forced labor can really occur across a diversity of settings and industries, and they include, but are certainly not limited to, agriculture, commercial fishing, forestry, landscape, and construction. There are situations where there are door-to-door sales through these traveling sales crews. You could see in-home or elder caregiving, certainly health and beauty salons, and really anything involving the hospitality industry or central points of tourism, if that happens to be part of your community. And when we are thinking critically of some of our Native communities, really in the production of traditional or cultural jewelry or traditional art making. So really considering what industries, what settings might be most pertinent to your community and being really vigilant for that. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. So these means of control are all used by traffickers to really compel men, women, and children to engage in these activities against their will. For force, we're seeing physical restraint or serious physical harm, such as sexual assault, beatings, or physical confinement. For fraud, these are false promises about work or living conditions, the use of fraudulent travel or work papers, certainly fraudulent employment offers, and the withholding of wages. And then finally, coercion. Now, these really include threats of harm, arrest, or deportation against a person or their loved one, the confiscation of their passport or your personal identifying documents, and other forms of psychological manipulation. And I will say that traffickers are relying more on coercive means of control because they leave less physical evidence and make it much harder to prove in a court of law. But it's really critical for us to all remember that even though you cannot see something physically keeping an individual in a trafficking situation, that does not mean that there are not coercive bonds influencing them that are just as strong. In some of the cases that we have situations where the trafficker, the abuser, the exploiter is actually an intimate partner of the victim, and that they've taken that time to sort of break down that individual's barriers, to build their trust, to build that rapport, and then use that against them to put them out on the street, to engage in commercial sex, or to work against their will, and that those emotional trauma bonds are very difficult to break down and really to replace with healthier ones once they've exited that situation. And that really takes very thoughtful work with a provider to regain that trust and to rebuild those healthy relationships with others. And with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to talk about the scope of the issue.
Thank you so much, Beth. All right, so on this next slide, if you look at the numbers on the slide, you can see that violence against Alaska Native and American Indian women is problematic, to say the least. Unfortunately, these numbers represent a small scale of a much larger problem. In general, domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking are not widely reported. However, accurate statistical data for instances of violence against women on reservations or in Indian country is in small quantity. The majority of victims of sex trafficking do not see themselves as such, at least initially. Many are made to believe that they have chosen to be in the life in order to provide for themselves, their families, or as payback to their trafficker for providing basic needs and or substance abuse needs. This is where the coercion can be pretty powerful. The trafficker shames the victim into performing and tells them it was their choice, which also contributes to the low reporting of victimization. According to the framing paper summary on conducting research and providing training and technical assistance on human trafficking of American Indians and Alaska Natives, a report from the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center in 2009 found that 27% of the 95 Native women and girls interviewed reported activities constituting sex trafficking under Minnesota law. A 2011 study showed that 79% of the 105 women interviewed had been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. 92% had been raped in prostitution, and 84% had been physically assaulted in prostitution. And as we continue with the next slide, this issue is prevalent all over the country. But here in Alaska, there are many factors that play into the high rate of sex trafficking of Alaska Natives and American Indians. Local numbers provided by Loyola University's 10-city study of trafficking among homeless youth shows that out of the 65 in-person interviews at Covenant House, Alaska, 26% were identified as victims of some sort of human trafficking. In 2010, the Anchorage Police Department and the FBI estimated that Alaska Natives made up 30% of the sex trafficking cases they were investigating. Authorities have stated that highly vulnerable targets are Alaska Native girls from rural communities. These girls are targeted because the traffickers find them to be already broken and in need of validation. Traffickers also feel that the Alaska Native population is able to be marketed as other desirable races, which increases the buyer market. There is growing concern about the practice of homeless rural youth who become involved in the sex trade in Anchorage being coerced to call other young relatives from their hometowns or villages, encouraging them to come to Anchorage with promises of a better life. When they arrive in the city, they are recruited or forced into the commercial sex trade. And with that, Beth, please tell us more about the national hotline trends.
Thanks, Heather. So as I mentioned, the HHS administers the grant program for the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is currently held by an organization named Polaris. And this hotline is available 24/7 for engagement from survivors, victims in crisis, to the general public, to practitioners looking to build referrals and resources, and law enforcement interested in making those connections for reporting. And the hotline actually maintains a database of hotline trends based on the signals that they receive. And these signals are not just phone calls, but they are also text messages messages, emails, and web form submissions through their website. So in terms of the hotline trends that we're seeing for Native communities, and really being inclusive of American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, we have some hotline trends to share from December 2007 through June of last year. All told, the hotline received 175 reported cases of potential trafficking where the potential victim was identified as Native. And these occurred in a variety of contexts, some in reservation or Pueblo communities, some actually in urban or suburban communities. You can see here a breakdown of the cases that were reported. So 148 of those reported cases reference sex trafficking, 11 labor, some cases where sex and labor were present, and others where none was specified. And here you can also see the top forms of sex and labor trafficking, or the top industries referencing Native victims. So for sex trafficking, we're seeing residentially based commercial sex. So this is where commercial sex is occurring in a private residence, in a home. Certainly online, hotel, motel, and then escort delivery services, sort of in-call, out-call, where through an online ad or through word of mouth, there is a phone number that's disseminated, and buyers are out there arranging for dates at any of these locations with someone who is actually a victim of trafficking, and is being controlled by a third-party trafficker. For labor trafficking, the most frequent industries reported here are domestic work, actually. So labor happening in a private household, either through caregiving or housekeeping. Traveling sales crews, which I mentioned, were these door-to-door sales where, particularly in reservation communities where Native youth are actually being lured off the reservation with these job promises that actually don't pan out to be what was initially promised. These opportunities to get rich quick, to kind of get out and see the world, but in actuality are removing them from their support network, taking them into cities, forcing them to sell magazines or cleaning products, and if they fail to meet that quota, then that is either strictly enforced with physical violence or psychological coercion. We have survivors of those networks who are calling the hotline in crisis, who are in cities they're not from, trying to get home. Certainly illicit activities, hearing reports of Native individuals who are being forced to participate in drug manufacturing and dissemination, both in urban settings and in reservation contexts, and again, being forced or coerced to do this against their will. And then finally, in healthcare settings, interestingly enough, and really thinking through some of the healthcare facilities you might have in your community, some of the elder care facilities you might have in your community, and really what the labor and the recruitment process looks like there. If you go to the next slide. So in terms of the age of the victims that were reported, we're actually seeing fairly even split between adult and minors reported to the hotline. While the reported cases overwhelmingly reference women and girls here, it's really important to remember that men, boys, LGBT two-spirited community, and other gender nonconforming individuals are also at risk for human trafficking within our Native communities here, but you can see that gender breakdown for what is reported. Now, the caveat to these numbers is that, this is not prevalence, because the hotline, unlike law enforcement in our communities, is not an investigative entity, so they're not going out there to verify necessarily the details on a call. They're there to be, triaging, crises, to be connecting them with referrals and services. So the hotline is really relying on, one, the public's awareness of them and their services, and the awareness of, the tribal status of a potential victim that they're encountering when they make that call. So it's likely that there are actually more victims, more Native victims that are reported to the hotline but are failing to identify as such. So that's one really important disclaimer to these numbers. And with that, we're going to move on to historical trauma.
Okay, so you can see a definition of historical trauma on the slide in front of you. It is important to understand how historical trauma is an underlying current for all present traumas that may affect an American Indian or Alaska Native victim. The abuse of American Indian and Alaska Native women and children can be traced to the introduction of unnatural lifeways into Native culture. Scholars support this idea and suggest that violence against American Indian and Alaska Native women directly relates to historical victimization. According to the proponents of this idea, domination and oppression of Native peoples increased both economic deprivation and dependency through retracting tribal rights and sovereignty. Consequently, American Indian and Alaska Natives today are believed to suffer from internalized oppression and the normalization of violence. One of the contributing factors to this is rooted in the knowledge that Alaska Native and American Indian history is an oral tradition. The act of hearing the stories of trauma causes the listener to feel as if the trauma has personally occurred to them. When working with and among tribal communities, it's vital that we understand and recognize the legacy of colonization, forced relocation away from their historic land, separation of parents and families, and placement of children in boarding schools and other historic trauma continues to impact tribal people today. It is also important to note that for the Alaska Native peoples, this trauma happened within the past 50 to 70 years. This historical trauma results in defense mechanisms, developmental malfunctions, and behavioral issues, as well as depression, anger, isolation, violence and suicide, shame, substance abuse, and anxiety. And we can go on to the next slide where we're going to talk about the risk factors for Native communities. So as you're looking at these risk factors, I would like to share a little bit of background of one of the participants in our program. At an early age, she had a history of extreme neglect and abuse. By the age of 12, she had been sexually abused by 4 different men in her life and had been physically, mentally, and emotionally abused by her parents and older siblings. And from that abuse, she was sent to a foster care home. It was there that she was introduced to marijuana, alcohol, and meth in her village and began to be trafficked. She became pregnant with her first child. And all of this happened in her village where everyone knows everyone. While human trafficking can happen to anyone, certain populations are more vulnerable and are at higher risk for becoming victims. Many of the listed risk factors make Native populations especially vulnerable to human trafficking. For those who leave the reservation or their Native community, this vulnerability can often increases by the loss of their social network and support of extended family. It's important to note that amongst Indigenous children, the high number of them in foster care is a major risk factor. As children in foster care often have a multitude of the above risk factors in their day-to-day life, making them particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. And so as we move on to the next slide, we're going to talk about where you might encounter some victims. There are many places where you can encounter individuals who have been trafficked. This list here provides a few examples, but is definitely not exhaustive. One of the most likely places we have found to encounter victims here in Alaska is the Ted Stevens International Airport in Anchorage. Due to the lack of road systems in Alaska, transportation is done by air and boat, with travel to larger cities primarily done by plane. Alaska Native youth have the ability to fly without an ID or chaperone. When boarding the planes, they do not need to go through security or present identification, making it easy to recruit Native youth from rural communities. And now on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the potential red flags for trafficking.
Thanks, Heather. And some of the risk factors that Heather mentioned really kind of boil down to what we refer to as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And one of the things that for me is encouraging as a practitioner is that, ACEs really don't have to be a foregone conclusion, right? That at any point, a well-timed intervention or prevention from a practitioner across any of the settings on the previous slide can pull that individual off that trajectory, right, of possible exploitation or possible violence or possible, future risk of violence or disease. So for me, that was very encouraging that, there's a critical role that we all play as practitioners in our various settings to be screening, our client population for some of these risks and tailoring our services to those needs. So on this slide here, there are a variety of red flags that may indicate either sex or labor trafficking, and these red flags may be physical, behavioral, or social or environmental. And the list here provides some examples, but it's certainly not an exhaustive list of what any individual might present with for human trafficking. As Heather noted with the case example with ANJC, for a lot of individuals at risk or individuals who have been trafficked, typically their trafficking is not their first victimization. They are often exploited or have experienced multiple traumas at various phases of their life, and that those traumatic experiences have then made them vulnerable to recruitment or to coercion or to trafficking. And, these issues they then present when you work with them may be related to the trauma of their trafficking or their prior trauma as well. So there's really layers of the service delivery here. But some of these in the physical category would certainly be signs of self-harm, sort of persistent health issues that go untreated, maybe because they're not receiving regular care, certainly frequent sexually transmitted infections, signs of physical or sexual abuse. For behavioral red flags, really looking at someone, in some of these situations, for those who have been removed from their communities, taken to places they're unfamiliar with, perhaps, they're unaware of where they are or what day or time it is, someone who has a heightened stress response, who might be exhibiting signs of PTSD. And then certainly in the environmental social section, we also have, youth who are repeat runaways, who, are very distrustful of authority figures, who maybe have a heightened risk of substance use, or a sudden change in their appearance, or the quality of the clothing or accessories that they might be having that might indicate someone is purchasing them for them. Are there any others that you wanted to highlight here, Heather?
One of the big things that would probably be important to just note is that the social or environmental, the change in dress, like we had talked about, or the evidence of being controlled. Most of the time, these victims don't have access to anything. They don't have their identification. Sometimes one of the things that we have found here in Alaska is they take away their shoes because it keeps them from running. It's cold, it's icy. You don't really want to be out there in bare feet. And so they're constantly trying to find ways to control and manipulate these victims. So those are those social, behavioral, physical. It's very important to remember that when we go back to coercion, there can be a lot of the non-physical things that are happening in their life that can also be a potential red flag as well.
Absolutely. The other thing that we'll notice is really debunk kind of a misconception around the relationship between a trafficker and the victim. So there was this thought originally that trafficking was perpetrated upon, by strangers, that there was this kind of stranger danger situation. And there was a study that was actually done by Covenant House in New York City in 2013 with their youth trafficked client population that found that 36% of children in their care were actually trafficked by their parents or immediate family member. So there are situations in which, due to poverty, due to some issues related to survival or substance use, that you have these situations in which a parent or a guardian or a family member is actually sex trafficking a child or a loved one or an intimate partner. And we certainly have situations in both sex and labor trafficking where again, as we mentioned before, that their trafficker, their exploiter, is their intimate partner, is their romantic partner, and that those trauma bonds are very powerful.
Absolutely. So, Beth, with that really quick, when I think about the victim that I shared about earlier, her trafficker was known to her in her community. So, it's those people that are in our day-to-day life. One of the things that we have come in contact with here in Alaska is teens who are using blackmail, getting into relationships with girls and asking them for pictures and then using that as blackmail to coerce them into the sex trade. So there's all kinds of manipulation that goes along with it, but it's almost always, it seems to be, at least in the cases we've encountered, people who they know.
Right, absolutely. And one of the resources that Richard's going to send out after this call is actually the link to screening tools for those of you who are practitioners who are working in healthcare, behavioral health, social service, public health settings, who might have an opportunity for protocol development and screening. We are going to share that with you guys. So HHS has the Assistant Secretary of Planning and Evaluation who partnered with the Children's Bureau in recent years to pilot a life experiences survey with youth specifically in runaway and homeless youth and foster care and child welfare settings. So there is a short form associated with that, really looking at risk and red flags for child trafficking. And then finally, the TNTA provider that I supervise, NITAC, the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, last year developed and released an adult human trafficking screening tool to accompany our sort of health and wellness training. And that just includes 8 questions for screening for risk and for possible trafficking that we'll make sure that we share with you all to consider adapting and integrating within your service settings. And with that, we'll move on to the next slide. So in terms of building a community response, every person who has been trafficked is unique and will certainly require a different mix of services. So there's really no one-size-fits-all here. And a vital component of responding to trafficking is really collaborating across the diverse sectors of experts who can provide services within your community. And these can include legal aid, housing, medical care, behavioral health services, and peer support. And it's really important that you build a referral network insofar that you are able, as well as a protocol for making and receiving referrals. And this includes strategies for trauma-informed care, such as providing a warm handoff when your patient or client receives services from a new provider, and really explaining to that client the process and maybe some of the limitations perhaps of the services that they'll be receiving, to provide them as much visibility and as much transparency as possible around that. And Heather, do you want to speak a little bit to how you all have approached community partnerships in Alaska?
Absolutely. So through the DVHP grant, ANJC has been able to build a network of service organizations in order to provide housing, behavioral health, medical, vocational and educational training, treatment for substance abuse, and case management. As a network, we're able to provide wraparound service in order to lessen the service gaps that we would encounter each working independently. So this multidisciplinary team response is important in assisting our victims in taking back control over their lives.
Yeah, and there have certainly been situations in rural communities where, there was a red flag or a victim did self-disclose or did identify, and their actually preference was that they not be served by someone known to their community. And in those situations, transportation resources were vitally critical, and really working within that larger community to ensure that warm handoff was occurring over many hundreds of miles, right, to ensure that they were meeting that client where they were at, where they felt they needed to be. And responses and organizational involvement can also differ depending on where you are in the spectrum. So really, when you think about your community partners, think about who within this colorful wheel here is best equipped to possibly intervene or prevent with a population that's at risk for being trafficked, for a client base that's currently experiencing human trafficking, or someone who maybe historically has been trafficked. So really thinking through those three sort of buckets of possible clients that you could be working with to prevent, to reduce, and to mitigate some of the trauma that they might have experienced. And with that, we'll go to a case study. And I'm actually going to read this case study aloud to all of us, and then Heather and I are going to take turns going through the questions, which we're going to pose to you all and invite you to participate via the chat feature. So if you see to the right, there should be a chat function enabled, and as long as the 2 is for all attendees, you should be able to type your responses after we finish reading the case study. So this case study is for a woman named Janet, and again, we've removed any identifiers here in this situation. We're protecting the confidentiality of the survivor, and I'll go ahead and read it. So Janet is a member of the Klamath tribe of American Indians. She grew up with a physically, sexually, and emotionally abusive father. Janet responded to the trauma of her home life by cutting herself and began to consider suicide when she was just 11 years old. As a young woman, Janet married a man who was also abusive. After they were divorced, Janet had little money and nowhere to live. She and her children moved in with an acquaintance who coerced Janet into sex trafficking using physical violence and the threat of harming Janet's daughters to force her to cooperate. While Janet was being trafficked, she interacted with social workers and healthcare providers. Unfortunately, not all of them used trauma-informed care during their interactions with her. On one such occasion, a social worker visited Janet's apartment to perform a child welfare check. She asked Janet if she was being abused, and Janet, fearful of her trafficker, lied and said that she was not. The social worker then asked Janet if she was Native American. When Janet said that she was, the social worker gave her a referral for a drug treatment program, even though Janet wasn't using any substances. So for this first question, can you guys identify the force, fraud, or coercion in Janet's case study? What were some examples of that? So if you recall, the trafficker was using physical violence, right, against her, and then was also using coercion in that the trafficker was threatening to harm Janet's daughters if she failed to cooperate. Heather, do you want to go ahead with the next question?
Yeah. Okay, so for the next question is, what barriers came between Janet and her service providers? And you can go ahead and type in your answer to the chat. All right, I'm not seeing chat answers. Are you seeing anything, Elizabeth?
No, not that I see. But certainly in this situation, it was very clear that she wasn't screened appropriately or in a safe place, right? You know, there was no evidence that the social worker checked the apartment to ensure that Janet was alone or really took the effort to build rapport with her over time so that she felt safe enough to perhaps divulge her victimization.
Absolutely, and there's probably a little bit of racism or prejudice in there as well, as she asked of, you know, whether she was Native American, and then when she said she was, she automatically went to a drug treatment program referral rather than just trying to get a little bit more information about Janet.
Absolutely.
There are 2 replies from a couple of our attendees. They didn't recognize the abuse and gave her referrals not needed. And a second reply was she did not trust her provider as she did not give her the full story.
Right.
Absolutely. So is there a way that these barriers could have been overcome?
And when you reply, I'll read them out.
Perfect.
Building rapport with Janet.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the first thing to do with trafficking victims is the realization that trust does not come easy to them. So they're not going to maybe initially identify as a trafficking victim or self-report. And so it's important to build that rapport with your potential victims as you're screening, knowing that it may take a little bit of time before they will break down and let you know exactly what's going on.
There's a few more replies that just came in, and one suggested that taking more time to learn her story. And
Yeah,
another reply is trained in trauma-informed care.
Yes, that is a big key. If her social worker had been trained in trauma-informed care, she would have known to recognize the signs that there needed to be more in that conversation. It needed to be located in a different location, in a different atmosphere. And so, yes, that absolutely would have helped to overcome those barriers.
And we have a few more. By learning about different cultures.
Yes, absolutely. Cultural trainings, you know, while we're all the same as human beings, we're all so different because of our culture and our backgrounds, and so it's so important to make sure that we do have those trainings and are aware of how that affects our perception when it comes to abuse and violence.
We have a few more. Interview outside of the home.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That would go also under that trauma-informed care training, knowing that the screening needed to happen not where her trafficker was with her.
And 2 more. Becoming aware of human trafficking patterns.
Absolutely, absolutely. As you learn more about human trafficking, while no case is exactly the same as others, there are a lot of patterns that are similar, and so it is very important to be aware of those and know the best practices in trying to take care of your clients as best as possible.
And lastly, we have the last reply. The worker listening to the full story and understanding her history.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so all of this, you know, comes down to knowing that things take time. Building a relationship with your clients takes time. Building that rapport and just being sensitive to the fact that you need to be able to take them into a safe location where they're away from their trafficker, where they can be honest, and take that time to build trust with them.
And I'll add one last question. Sometimes when there's a suspicion, even if you ask, they may not confirm that they're being or that they're not in a trafficking situation. Is that right?
Absolutely. Most victims, when initially approached, will not identify as a victim. As I discussed earlier, many of them have been coerced to the point where they believe that they are making those choices on their own. If they're under the age of 18, they cannot make the choice to be in the commercial sex trade, as Beth shared earlier. And so as an adult, even if they are still in that commercial sex trade, they may feel like, well, it's my choice now, and so they may not identify as a victim. It may take some time with the service provider to just continually share information, continually to educate and listen, and just listen and meet them where they are. And eventually, if they feel safe, they will share.
Right. I think Heather hit the nail on the head there, and I think this is also underscoring why training and awareness raising is so critically important, because some communities don't have the language, right, to articulate what trafficking is. There isn't this consciousness of this crime, of this form of violence, and human trafficking is a complex form of violence that's often interrelated and tied to other forms of trauma that they're experiencing, and can often be misidentified or identified as something else. And so there are really layers of complexity to trafficking. And I think, as Heather said, just meeting the client where they're at, seeing those red flags and trying to provide for the immediate needs of that client as you work to build rapport, as you use the language that your clients are using to mirror back to them, to signal that you're a safe space, and really, again, meeting them where they're at and at that pace, that a disclosure, while not your sole purpose, might be something that will occur incrementally over time, over those interactions.
Absolutely. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and continue on into the next slide, where we will talk about cultural practices. There is a list here, and it's definitely not exhaustive, but it does give some idea of different ways that we can be culturally sensitive to our victims. So restoring cultural practices as a form of healing and prevention, both initially and to prevent re-victimization, can vary between different traditional cultures throughout the country. While cultural traditions may not always look the same, the connection to community and family is prevalent. It is through the embracing and offering of these traditional practices that can promote healing and restoration to victims of trafficking. So one of the things that we do here at ANJC is we have women's gatherings, and that is a safe place for women to come and do some sort of culturally relevant activity, whether it's beading or making dream catchers, but it provides a safe place for women to come together and connect, and that connection is key in their healing process.
Absolutely, and I think peer support is a critical part of the restoration and the service delivery that we all do as practitioners that isn't always the first to jump into our mind, right? But you all as practitioners in your community know what specific traditions or cultural practice most resonate with your population. So really consider to incorporate some of those traditional healing or forms of restorative justice that would most resonate with who you work with, and really building and fostering that resiliency with a connection to their cultural practice. And with that, we'll move on to a resource that was jointly developed by the Administration for Native Americans and the Office on Trafficking in Persons that was launched in 2017. If you guys are an ANA grantee, you guys probably already are aware and hopefully are utilizing this resource. But this toolkit was developed for Indigenous youth and Native serving organizations to really raise awareness around human trafficking, its impact on Native communities, and really provide concrete action items for how Native youth can not only prevent or protect themselves, but also have these conversations within their community to raise the awareness of this as an issue as it impacts Native communities. And this was a resource that was developed in consultation with tribal youth, with ACF Native grantees, with Native survivors, and by our federal partners. And we really say that this is our beta launch, that we're really committed to refining and tweaking this resource moving forward. So we really welcome your feedback on its utility and its tone and its strategies for really keeping it current. One of the things that we all know from this webinar and just our work is that, this can be a very heavy topic, and this toolkit, really we tried to embody a strengths-based or empowerment-based approach. So we tried to choose imagery that depicted Native resiliency. We tried to provide concrete action items for youth to meaningfully engage in to, again, prevent trafficking, and really wanted to lift up the storytelling of Native survivors, so you'll see quotes throughout this. But this is available in both the ANA and the OTIP resource library. There's a link here on this slide that will be shared afterwards, and we really hope that you guys will incorporate this into your practice if you are working with Native youth in your community. We also want to highlight some free technical assistance that is available to you all. So I supervise NITAC, the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center, which administers anti-trafficking training to the public, to HHS grantees, to public health and healthcare professionals on how to identify and respond to human trafficking in a trauma-informed and culturally sensitive way. And there is a way to request training of us by emailing info@nitac.org or calling our customer support center at 844-648-8822, where you'll speak to a TNTA specialist to assess your needs. One of the signature curriculum that we disseminate and we produced is something called the SOAR to Health and Wellness Training. And SOAR is an acronym that stands for Stop, Observe, Ask, and Respond to Human Trafficking. And this is an accredited training for healthcare and social services professionals that we develop across a three-tiered approach. So we have training for individuals, and that's largely administered through our learning management system, which is free for anyone to create an account. You guys can log in to take any of our modules in both English and Spanish at your own pace and then apply for CEs or CMEs. So there are some states, some tribes that are considering legislation or who have passed legislation requiring frontline responders, emergency professionals, or educators or healthcare providers to take anti-trafficking training as a condition of their licensure renewal. And this is a training where you will receive a certificate of completion that would fulfill that obligation. So we do want you guys to be aware of that free resource. We also provide online blended learning at an organizational level through cohorts where we convene professionals from similar organizations in similar settings to really help them think through how their organization can respond to trafficking within their various programs, how they can institutionalize protocols and policies for victim identification and service response. And then finally, we provide SOAR training in person across several days for communities, and really doing a community assessment with multidisciplinary teams, really meeting them where they're at and coming up with some strategic planning for how communities can better respond to this issue. For the last 6 months, we've actually been working with Native experts and our colleagues at the Administration for Native Americans to produce SOAR for Native communities. So this is a training that we've been piloting recently at several Native conferences and that we will be hopefully releasing by the end of March this year. So please keep an eye out for that. It will also be online and freely available to those who are interested. On this next slide, we'll just mention the National Human Trafficking Hotline, whose statistics that we cited. Again, this is a resource 24/7 anywhere in the U.S. or its territories. Calls can be answered in 172 languages through a tele-interpreting service, and unlike other hotlines, they are not a direct report to law enforcement. While they certainly serve as mandated reporters, they are a confidential resource and do receive calls from clients, from victims, from survivors in crisis. They've really taken the time to build a network of national, local protocols that include trained referrals for trafficking. So if you are a service organization who are interested in receiving cases referred through the hotline, I would encourage you guys to reach out to them at www.humantraffickinghotline.org for more information or for considering to join part of that referral network. And then finally, we just have some other federal resources from our partners that we wanted to offer you all as well. The Department of Homeland Security's Blue Campaign has a mandate to raise awareness of this issue, and in the last couple months they've produced not only a PSA on sex trafficking in Native communities, but also a poster series for awareness raising among Native communities on trafficking. So we've included those hyperlinks here. So for those who are interested in downloading some resources, printing them, and putting them in their own community, really encouraging you guys to go to DHS Blue Campaign. HHS is also in the process of adapting our own awareness-raising campaign called Look Beneath the Surface, so that it is Native-specific and culturally responsive, and hope to have an update for you guys over the next fiscal year. Finally, we have additional training for those of you in communities with casinos. The National Indian Gaming Commission has partnered with the FBI and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to offer regional training, which is inclusive of trafficking. And then finally, some additional resources for you all to consider from our colleagues at the Department of Justice, and an information memorandum from our colleagues at ANA.
Well, thank you both for your great presentations, and I'd like to open up now for questions from the chat room. If you have any questions, feel free to pose them, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time given. And if I'll stay a little bit later. If you continue to have questions, I will cite them and share them with our presenters to make sure you get answers. And just as a reminder, I will be sending out an evaluation along with the information that was mentioned previously. Those will be two different emails. I'll send out an email with the links and information, and a link and another email for the evaluations. So with that, I'd like to open up the chat. And are there any other questions at this time? We have a question just come up. Is there information for the more intensive training?
Sure. So SOAR for Native Communities, which I just mentioned, is our more intensive training that we're looking to include as part of our learning management system. So we'll notify you guys once that has been accredited and loaded into the system. Also, definitely consider reaching out to the ANA TA providers, in addition to our own NITAC, for more specialized training. So if you are working within a particular setting or working within a particular community and you are really interested for a more tailored or specialized approach, really encourage you guys to contact NITAC or any of the ANA TA centers for us to develop a plan for that.
Yes, and we'll certainly be able to connect you with the right people with that. Are there any more questions? We'll take a few moments to wait. There isn't a reply right now. Is there any other replies from the presenters that you might like to add as we wrap up?
No, I really just want to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy days to join us on this important issue, and look forward to continuing this conversation in the future.
Great. And as I said before, look for emails from me. And if you have questions, feel free to bring them along, and I will make sure that you get an answer as best as we can provide. Thank you both for your great presentations. Appreciate the time and effort that you took in presenting the important information on human trafficking. I think it was very well informative, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great Thursday.
Thank you. And with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Goodbye.